Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Yoma Daf Pei Beis contains two Mishnayos. It begins with one Mishnah which discusses when a child begins practicing fasting for Yom Kippur. At what age should he or she start doing fasting? And then the next Mishnah discusses somebody who is in a situation of sakana. They need to eat. How do we determine when they are allowed to eat because of the danger and when they are not? The Gemara will continue discussing when we say which are the three averos that a person must give his life for, even in a place of sakana, and how we derive each of them. So first of all, let's begin. The Mishnah that begins the daf discusses when does a child begin his education. So the Mishnah uses an interesting phrase. It says the education begins before a year before a year, or 2 years before a year. A year before a year or 2 years before a year. We explained that that means a year before a year means 2 years before the bar mitzvah, the bar or bas mitzvah, and 2 years before a year means 3 years before the bar or bas mitzvah. So that means as follows. A child is obligated to fast midaraisa at his bar mitzvah for a boy. That's when he turns 13. He completes 13 years of life. And a girl is obligated when she turns bas mitzvah, which is on her 12th birthday, when she completes 12 years of life. When are they supposed to start practicing fasting? The Mishnah says it's supposed to start 2 or 3 years before then, according to how we understand the expression a year before a year and 2 years before a year. Now, the Gemara obviously asks, what is 2 years or 3 years? Which is it? If they're supposed to start practicing fasting from 3 years, then they are already practicing by the time they get to 2 years. Why do I have to say 2 years or 3 years? So Gemara is going to have a few explanations here according to a few different Amoraim. The Gemara's first explanation is Rav Chisda, and he says we're referring to different constitutions of children. A healthy child can start 3 years before bar or bas mitzvah, and a sickly child will start 2 years before bar or bas mitzvah. Now the Gemara gets into a machlokes Amoraim, how this education process plays out, and based on that, each of those opinions will have to explain how the Mishnah is meant to be read. So the machlokes is as follows. It's Rav Huna and Rav Nachman against Rav Yochanan. Rav Huna and Rav Nachman say that this education goes in 2 stages. The final stage before the bar mitzvah is where they do a complete fast, midrabanan. That stage depends on how healthy they are. If it's a healthy child, they'll have 2 years of complete fast midrabanan. And if it's a sickly child, they'll have 1 year of complete fast midrabanan. However, the stage before that is 2 years of partial fasting. Those 2 years of partial fasting will be the same for all children, no matter how healthy they are. Now, Rav Chisda spells out how this fast works for a girl. He says that she'll be chayav deraisa from her 12th birthday. That means from her 11th birthday for a sickly child, she'll fast completely midrabanan. From her 10th birthday for a healthy child, she'll fast midrabanan. And the 2 years preceding that, which is 9 and 10 for a sickly child, or 8 and 9 for a healthy child, then she'll do a partial fast midrabanan. Now, Rav Nachman spells it out for a boy. Since from age 13 he has to fast midaraisa. A year before that, when from age 12 he'll fast midrabanan if he's not healthy. For 2 years before his bar mitzvah, age 11 and 12, he'll fast midrabanan if he is healthy. And 2 years preceding each of those, he'll fast partially for a few hours each Yom Kippur. Now, how are Rav Chisda and Rav Nachman going to explain the Mishnah? How do they understand the wording of the Mishnah? So the Gemara says, according to them, the Mishnah is very consistent, and it makes a lot of sense in its expression, a year before a year, or a year before 2 years, or 2 years before a year. Again, a year before a year, or 2 years before a year. And it means to say as follows. It's referring to a sickly child who only fasts midrabanan completely for 1 year before the bar mitzvah. So a year before a year means that he's supposed to start his fasts midrabanan a year before a year, meaning 2 years before he starts fasting midrabanan. That's when he starts fasting a few hours, 2 years before he fasts midrabanan. And that is 3 years before he starts fasting midaraisa. So again, the phrase year before year means 2 years before. 2 years before year means 3 years before. And he starts doing his his partial fasts 2 years before he fasts midrabanan completely, and 3 years before he fasts midaraisa completely. Now, the other opinion here is Rav Yochanan. Rav Yochanan cuts out the entire period of complete fast midrabanan. He does not have that at all. And he cuts down the hourly fasts to a year or 2 years, depending how healthy the child is. So Rav Yochanan says there is no point at which a child fasts a complete fast. For a year before the bar or bas mitzvah, he or she fasts a partial fast if she's sickly. If he or she is sickly, if it's a healthy child, then it's 2 years. So Gemara says, how is Rav Yochanan going to explain the Mishnah? Where do you have 2 years before anything or 3 years before anything? He only has a year before the bar mitzvah or 2 years before the bar mitzvah. So Gemara says he's not going to read the Mishnah that says a year before year or 2 years before year. That it doesn't mean 2 years or 3 years before. A year before year just means a year before the bar mitzvah. That's what it means. And 2 years before a year means 2 years before the bar mitzvah or the bas mitzvah. And that's how he explains it. It's referring to the hourly fast, the partial fast, and they begin a year before the bar mitzvah for a sickly child, and 2 years before the bar mitzvah for a healthy child. Now the Gemara has a proof to Rabbi Yochanan. It's a brisa brought by Rabbi Bar Shmuel, who says that you do not make children fast, but you're mechanech them a year or 2 before the bar mitzvah. So this clearly says Rabbi Yochanan, this is your mechanech them, which seems to mean partial fast, and it says a year or 2 before the bar or bas mitzvah. So it fits with Rabbi Yochanan perfectly. The Gemara says no. Rav Huna and Rav Nachman will say this is referring to the complete fast midrabanan, which they also agree is a year or 2 for 1 or 2 years before the bar or bas mitzvah, depending on how healthy and strong the child is. Gemara asks the question, we have a brisa that says chinuch means partial fast. Chinuch means that they fast for an hour or 2 if they usually eat the second hour of the day, the third hour of the day, if usually the third hour, they wait until the 4th hour of the day. So Gemara answers there's 2 types of chinuch. That brisa is talking about one type of chinuch, and this brisa, which discusses when the chinuch begins, how many years before, is talking about the other type of chinuch. It's talking about the chinuch to do a complete fast in advance of the actual year when they will be bar or bas mitzvah and have to fast midaraisa. Now begin the next Mishnah, which introduces the halacha of when you can feed somebody who's in a situation of danger because of not eating. And the Mishnah talks about 2 types of people. One is a pregnant woman who smelled roasting meat. She has to eat because if she does not, it could be a danger both to herself and to the fetus. And the other is a sick person who needs to eat because he needs nutrition. So as far as the pregnant woman, the Mishnah says you feed her until her mind is put at ease. When she feels cravings, you have to feed her until she's put at ease. As far as the sick person, so you should need a medical determination as to whether he needs to eat or not, and that should be 2 experts, 2 professional physicians should be there to determine that he needs to eat for his health. If you don't have 2 doctors there, then you use his own determination. When he says, I need to eat, you feed him until he says that I had enough. Now the Gemara introduces a brisa which teaches us the halacha that there are only 3 averos which a person is obligated to risk his life to avoid. The brisa says as follows: a pregnant woman who smells cooking or roasting basar kodesh or basar chazir. That is 2 types of meat she's not allowed to eat. One is carbon meat, and the other is pig meat. So what should you do? She's not allowed to eat this meat. So you try to get her cravings to be assuaged with as little as possible satisfaction. But if you need to, you go all the way. And that is, first you soak a bit of the juice in a cloth and put it on her mouth. If that's enough, good. If not, then you give her the actual sauce to eat, which is not the actual meat itself. And if that doesn't satisfy her, then you give her the actual meat. Because the Brisa spells it out, there is no mitzvah, no avera that stands before risk of life, except for the big 3: avodah zarah, idol worship, gili arayas, that's immoral relations, and shvichas damim, spilling blood, murder. Now the Gemara says, what is the source for each of these? How do you know that these 3 you are supposed to give up your life to avoid? So the Gemara says, as far as avodah zarah, the Torah says pretty clearly, b'chol, you should love Hashem, b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha, b'chol maidecha. B'chol nafshecha means you have to give up your life. Now the Brisa also spells out what's the difference. Why does it say b'chol nafshecha and b'chol maidecha? B'chol nafshecha means with your life, and b'chol maidecha means with all your possessions. The Gemara says because there are some people that their lives are more important to them than their possessions, so you have to say even give up your lives. There are other people though that their possessions are more important to them than their lives. You have to tell them that they even have to give up their possessions, not only their lives. Now, how do we know that Gili Rayas and murder? How do we know that immoral interactions and murder are both required for one to give up his life rather than violate these two averos? So Gemara says the two of them are linked, and we learn two halachas one from the other. Where are the two linked? The Torah discussing a girl who was raped says Ki kasher yakom ish areu ritzachei nefesh ken hadavar hazeh. Says that she's a victim, just like a murder victim. She is a victim of the rape that happened to her. So the Gemara says, so you see the Torah is comparing murder and rape. How do you compare the two? So there is a halacha learned from one to the other. Just like we know that you're allowed to kill a rapist in order to save the girl from being his victim, and you see that because the Torah says that it's not her fault, there was nobody there to save her. That implies that if somebody was there to save her, he can do so by any means. So you learn that halacha, the halacha of roidef, you learn that halacha from the rapist that you're allowed to kill to save the girl, to murder where you're allowed to kill the attacker, the murderer, in order to save the victim's life. Now, you also learn halacha the other way, and that is just like you're not allowed to kill somebody to save your own life, you're also not allowed to commit an immoral act to save your own life. And there we see that Gilei Rais and Shvichas Damim both are Yeherag Val Yavar. They're something that you should allow yourself to be killed rather than violate. So the Gemara says, how do you even know that you're supposed to allow yourself to be killed rather than kill somebody else? The Gemara says that it's logic. The Gemara says there was an incident that happened where somebody asked Rava that the chief of my town is saying I better kill somebody or he's going to kill me. And he said, you let him kill you. Who says that your blood is better than the other guy's blood? Rashi explains, the only reason that the Torah tells you to give up your life rather than violate an avera is that the life of a Jew is more precious than the mitzvah. However, here a life of a Jew is going to be lost either way, either yours or the person that you're going to kill. So what right do you have to violate an avera to save your life? Your life is not more precious than the other person's life. Who says that it's worth an avera to choose your life over his life? Either way, a life is going to be lost. Don't let the avera be committed along the way. Now the Gemara brings two incidents about women who smelled roasting meat and they had to eat it. Where it says there was one woman who was pregnant and she smelled something and she had to eat it, and they came to Rebbe and said, what should we do? So he said, whisper in her ear, today's Yom Kippur. They went and whispered in her ear, and her craving subsided. So the Gemara assumes that it was the fetus that was having the cravings, and the whispering in the ear spoke to the fetus. The Gemara said that Rebbe heard about it. When he heard the report, he said the following pasuk b'terem and tzarcha b'beten yidaticha. Before it was even created in the womb, I already knew you. And indeed, this child was born and grew up to be none other than Rabbi Yochanan. It was a different story where there was a woman who was similarly pregnant. She had cravings, and they came to Rabbi Chanina, and he said, whisper in her ear that it's Yom Kippur. They did, but nothing helped. She had to eat. And on that, they said the pasuk Zeru Isham Mirechem To Mi Beten. Already in the stomach, he's already wicked. And the child that was born turned out to be Shabsai Oitzer Peri, person by the name of Shabsai, who would hoard fruit in order to drive the price up and then sell it at a steep price, gouging.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.